They say trust is the foundation of every family. But what happens when the person sitting across from you at Sunday dinner is the one plotting your funeral? What happens when the man your daughter brought home as her Prince Charming turns out to be a wolf in sheep's clothing? What happens when you realize that the warm bowl of soup placed lovingly in front of you isn't meant to nourish your body, but to end your life forever?
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're a subscriber, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Tell us a duh.
My name is Harriet Dame, but most folks around Millbrook County have called me Grandma Hattie for the better part of 2 decades. I'm 78 years old, and I've lived through enough to know the difference between genuine kindness and calculated cruelty. For 8 months, I watched my son-in-law Edgar smile at my dinner table, compliment my cooking, and play the role of the devoted family man. He was so convincing that even I started to believe he actually cared about this old woman's well-being. But when Edgar ladled that mushroom bisque into my favorite china bowl on that cold February evening, his hands trembling just slightly as he set it before me, he made one critical mistake. He assumed that a 78-year-old grandmother would be an easy target, someone who would simply eat what was put in front of her without question, someone who would trust family without reservation, someone who would die quietly and conveniently when the poison did its work. What Edgar didn't know, what he couldn't have possibly known, was that this particular grandmother had spent 43 years working as a forensic toxicologist for the state crime lab. What he didn't realize was that the sweet old lady he'd been manipulating for months had analyzed more poison cases than he'd had hot dinners. And what would shock him most of all was that I'd been watching him just as carefully as he'd been watching me, documenting every lie, every manipulation, every calculated move in his elaborate scheme to inherit my life's savings. This is the story of how my son-in-law tried to murder me at my own dinner table, and how his own arrogance became his downfall. It's a story about family betrayal, the dangerous assumption that age equals ignorance, and what happens when someone underestimates a woman who has spent decades learning to spot killers from a mile away. You see, Edgar thought he was dealing with a lonely, vulnerable widow, who would be grateful for any attention from her daughter's handsome husband. What he was actually dealing with was a retired professional who had made a career out of catching people exactly like him. And by the time that soup bowl was empty and I was still very much alive, Edgar's carefully constructed plan was about to unravel in ways he never could have imagined. Before we dive into the depths of Edgar's deception, let me tell you about the life I built in Millbrook County, because understanding what I had is crucial to understanding what Edgar thought he could take from me. I moved to this small town in 1967, fresh out of graduate school with a chemistry degree, and a burning desire to use science to serve justice. The state crime lab was just expanding their toxicology department, and they needed someone who wasn't squeamish about analyzing the darkest aspects of human nature. For 4 decades, I examined evidence from suspicious deaths, unexplained illnesses, and cases where families suspected their loved ones had been murdered by people they trusted most. My late husband, Ernest Dame, used to joke that I was the only woman he knew who could determine cause of death over dinner conversation. Ernest was a high school principal, steady, kind, and completely supportive of my unconventional career choice. Together we built a comfortable life in our Victorian house on Elm Street, complete with a wraparound porch and the largest vegetable garden in the neighborhood. We never had children of our own, but that changed when my brother's daughter Ruby came to live with us at age 16. Ruby's parents had died in a car accident, and Ernest and I became her guardians, raising her as the daughter we'd never had. Ruby was brilliant, determined, and had inherited the family's stubborn streak in the best possible way. She graduated valedictorian from Millbrook High, earned a scholarship to nursing school, and eventually became head nurse at the county hospital. When Ruby met Edgar Holt 3 years ago, at a medical conference, I was genuinely happy for her. At 34, Ruby had focused so intensely on her career that romantic relationships had taken a back seat. Edgar was 41, recently divorced, and worked as a pharmaceutical sales representative. He was charming, well-dressed, and seemed completely devoted to my daughter from their very first date. Ernest had passed away 5 years earlier from complications related to diabetes, leaving me alone in our big house with more memories than I knew what to do with. Ruby worried about me constantly, calling every day, and insisting on weekly dinner visits to make sure I was eating properly and staying connected to the world. When she and Edgar got engaged after 18 months of dating, I was delighted. Not just because Ruby had found love, but because Edgar seemed like the kind of man who would help look after both of us as we aged. The wedding was lovely, a small ceremony in our backyard garden with just close friends and neighbors. Edgar moved into Ruby's apartment across town, but they visited every Sunday for dinner, a tradition that quickly became the highlight of my week. Edgar would help with yard work, fix small problems around the house, and always complimented my cooking with the kind of enthusiasm that made an old woman feel useful and appreciated. For the first year of their marriage, everything seemed perfect. Edgar was attentive without being overwhelming, helpful without being intrusive, and genuinely interested in family stories and local history. He asked thoughtful questions about my work at the crime lab, seemed fascinated by my cases, and often mentioned how impressive it was that a woman of my generation had succeeded in such a male-dominated field. Looking back now, I realize those questions weren't born of genuine interest. Edgar was conducting reconnaissance, learning about my expertise, so he could plan around it. He was studying my methods, my knowledge base, and my analytical approach to determine how to eliminate me, without raising the suspicions of someone trained to spot unnatural deaths. But I'm getting ahead of myself. At the time, I simply enjoyed having a son-in-law who seemed to value my experience and wisdom. After decades of being dismissed by some people as just the lab lady, it was refreshing to have someone treat my career as genuinely fascinating rather than morbidly unusual. The truth about Edgar's character wouldn't begin to emerge until after Ernest's estate was finally settled and people began to understand exactly how much this retired toxicologist was worth. That's when the Sunday dinners started to feel different, when Edgar's questions became more pointed, and when I began to notice that his interest in my well-being was perhaps a bit more calculated than I'd originally believed. But even with all my professional experience analyzing human nature's darkest impulses, I never suspected that the man eating at my table every week was already planning my funeral. The first sign that something had shifted in Edgar's behavior came about 6 months after the estate lawyers finished processing Ernest's will. Until that point, I'd assumed Edgar's occasional questions about my finances were the natural curiosity of a son-in-law concerned about his wife's mother living alone on a fixed income. But once the official documentation was filed with the county clerk's office, making my net worth a matter of public record, Edgar's interest in my well-being took on a distinctly different tone. You see, most people in Millbrook County knew I'd had a good job at the state crime lab, but they assumed government work meant a modest pension and simple living. What they didn't realize was that 43 years of expert witness testimony in high-profile criminal cases had provided substantial consulting fees beyond my regular salary. Ernest had been equally frugal and forward-thinking with his principal's salary and teacher's retirement fund. Combined with careful investments and the appreciation of our Victorian house in what had become the town's historic district, we'd accumulated considerably more wealth than our quiet lifestyle suggested. The exact figure that appeared in the public estate records was $2.30 million, a number that included our paid-off house, Ernest's life insurance policy, our joint investment portfolio, and the proceeds from a small inheritance I'd received from my parents' farm years earlier. For a childless couple who'd lived modestly in a small town, It represented a lifetime of careful financial planning and compound interest working in our favor.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
I first noticed Edgar's behavior change during a Sunday dinner in late September. Ruby was working a double shift at the hospital, so Edgar had come alone, something that had never happened before. He spent most of the evening asking detailed questions about the house's maintenance costs, property taxes, and whether I'd considered the financial burden I might become if I needed assisted living care in the future. "Harriet," Edgar said, his voice carrying a concern that felt slightly rehearsed, "I hope you don't mind me saying this, but Ruby and I worry about you managing all these expenses on your own. This house is so large for one person, and the upkeep costs must be enormous." I looked up from my pot roast, studying Edgar's expression with the same analytical attention I'd once applied to suspicious evidence samples. His concern seemed genuine enough, but there was something in his eyes, a calculation that hadn't been there during previous visits. "The house is paid for, dear," I replied carefully. "And Ernest was very thorough about setting up our finances to handle maintenance and taxes. I'm quite comfortable, actually." "Oh, I'm sure you are," Edgar said quickly, perhaps realizing his questions might seem inappropriate. "I just meant that as we all get older it might be worth considering whether downsizing could free up some resources for other things. Travel, hobbies, maybe setting up some financial security for Ruby's future." The mention of Ruby's financial future was particularly interesting, because my daughter had never expressed any concern about money. Her nursing salary was excellent, and she'd inherited Ernest's careful approach to saving and investing. If anyone in the family needed financial planning assistance, it certainly wasn't Ruby. But I smiled pleasantly and changed the subject to Edgar's work, asking about his pharmaceutical sales territory and whether he enjoyed the travel his job required. Edgar's company specialized in geriatric medications, drugs for diabetes, heart conditions, and cognitive issues that primarily affected elderly patients. His knowledge of senior health issues was extensive, and he often shared stories about the medical conferences he attended and the latest research in elderly care. "Actually," Edgar said, warming to the topic, "I've been learning a lot about medication interactions lately. It's amazing how dangerous some common combinations can be, especially for older people who might not realize they're taking incompatible drugs." He went on to describe several cases where elderly patients had experienced serious complications from mixing prescription medications with over-the-counter supplements or herbal remedies. His knowledge was impressive and genuinely concerning. Some of the interactions he described could cause symptoms that mimicked heart attacks, strokes, or other natural causes of death in elderly individuals. At the time, I appreciated Edgar's expertise and assumed he was sharing this information out of genuine concern for my well-being. Looking back, I realize he was testing my knowledge of pharmacology and gauging whether I understood the risks he was describing. He was also establishing himself as an authority on medication safety, positioning himself to make future suggestions about my health management. The conversation continued with Edgar asking about my current medications, just the basic prescriptions for blood pressure and cholesterol that most people my age take daily. He seemed particularly interested in my dosages and timing, claiming that his pharmaceutical training had taught him to spot potential problems that regular doctors sometimes missed. "You know," Edgar said as he helped me clear the dinner dishes, "if you ever have questions about drug interactions or side effects, I'd be happy to research them for you. Sometimes pharmacists are too busy to explain things thoroughly, and it's important that someone with your independence stays fully informed about these things." The pause before the word independence was subtle but noticeable. Edgar was already beginning to plant seeds about my potential vulnerability, suggesting that my self-reliant nature might actually be a liability when it came to managing complex medical decisions. Over the following weeks, Edgar's Sunday visits became more frequent. He'd stop by on Wednesday evenings to check on me, often bringing small gifts, herbal teas that he claimed would help with sleep, vitamin supplements that supposedly supported cognitive function, and homemade cookies from a bakery near his office. His thoughtfulness seemed genuine, and I found myself looking forward to his midweek visits as much as the family dinners. Ruby was delighted that her husband was developing such a close relationship with me. "Edgar really loves you, Mom," she told me during one of our phone calls. "He's always talking about how impressive your career was, and how much he enjoys hearing your stories about the crime lab. I think having you as a mother-in-law makes him feel like he's part of a really interesting family." Edgar had indeed been asking more questions about my work, but his inquiries were becoming increasingly specific. He wanted to know about detection methods for various poisons, how long different toxins remained identifiable in post-mortem examinations, and which substances were most difficult to trace during autopsy procedures. Again, I assumed his pharmaceutical background made these topics professionally relevant, and I enjoyed sharing my expertise with someone who seemed genuinely fascinated by forensic science. What I didn't realize was that Edgar was conducting advanced research for a project that had nothing to do with pharmaceutical sales, and everything to do with planning the perfect untraceable murder. The catalyst that changed everything came in early November, when I slipped on wet leaves while raking in my backyard, and twisted my ankle badly enough to require a walking boot for 6 weeks. It was a minor injury that would heal completely with time and rest, but Edgar treated it like a life-threatening emergency that required immediate family intervention. "Harriet, this is exactly what Ruby and I have been worried about," Edgar said when he arrived at the emergency room, still wearing his work suit and looking genuinely distressed. "You could have broken your hip, or hit your head on those concrete steps. What if this had happened when no one was around to find you?" Ruby was working her shift and couldn't leave the hospital, so Edgar had responded to my call for help. I'd managed to drive myself to the emergency room, but I appreciated having family support during the X-rays and treatment process. What I didn't appreciate was Edgar's immediate assumption that one minor accident meant I was no longer capable of living independently. "It's just a sprained ankle, dear," I told him as the doctor fitted my walking boot. "I'll be careful on the stairs for a few weeks, and everything will be back to normal." But Edgar had already shifted into crisis management mode, making phone calls to arrange time off work, and discussing care options with Ruby when she finally arrived. By the time we left the hospital, Edgar had convinced my daughter that I shouldn't be alone in my 2-story house, while recovering from what he described as a significant fall. "Mom, Edgar's right," Ruby said, her nursing training making her naturally cautious about elderly patients living alone after accidents. "You know as well as I do that most serious injuries happen at home. With that walking boot, you'll have trouble on stairs, and if you fell again," the solution Edgar proposed seemed perfectly reasonable. I would stay in their guest room for the 6 weeks my ankle healed. Their apartment was a single-story unit with an accessible bathroom, and Edgar's flexible sales schedule would allow him to check on me during the day while Ruby worked her hospital shifts. "It's just temporary," Edgar assured me, his concern appearing completely genuine. "Once you're steady on your feet again, you'll go right back home. But Ruby and I will have peace of mind knowing you're safe while you recover." I agreed to the arrangement, though something about Edgar's enthusiasm for the plan struck me as slightly excessive. Looking back, I realized this ankle injury was exactly the opportunity Edgar had been waiting for, a legitimate reason to get me out of my familiar environment and into a space where he could monitor my activities, control my access to information, and gradually establish new routines that would serve his ultimate purposes. The guest room in Ruby and Edgar's apartment was comfortable enough, with a queen bed, a small sitting area, and windows that looked out onto their apartment complex's courtyard. Ruby had decorated it thoughtfully with some of my favorite photographs and a selection of books from my home library. Edgar had insisted on bringing my favorite coffee maker and tea set, claiming he wanted me to feel as comfortable as possible during my stay. What I initially interpreted as thoughtful hospitality, I now understand was strategic manipulation. Edgar was creating an environment where I would feel grateful for his care while becoming increasingly dependent on his assistance for daily activities. The ankle injury provided perfect cover for this gradual shift in our relationship dynamic. During my first week in their home, Edgar's attentiveness was remarkable. He prepared my meals, helped me navigate the apartment safely, and made sure I had everything I needed within easy reach. He even rearranged their living room furniture to create clear pathways for my walking boot, demonstrating the kind of consideration that made Ruby beam with pride about her thoughtful husband. "Edgar's been amazing," Ruby told me one evening after work. "I was so worried about how we'd manage your care with my hospital schedule, but he's handled everything perfectly. You're lucky to have such a caring son-in-law." Indeed, Edgar's care was impeccable, perhaps too impeccable. He seemed to anticipate my needs before I expressed them, appeared whenever I tried to do something independently, and gradually established himself as the intermediary between me and the outside world. When neighbors called to check on me, Edgar answered and provided updates. When my doctor's office scheduled follow-up appointments, Edgar coordinated the transportation and accompanied me to ensure I received proper care. Most significantly, Edgar took over management of my mail and messages, explaining that he wanted to spare me the stress of dealing with administrative tasks while I recovered. This meant he was screening my phone calls, sorting through my correspondence, and essentially controlling my communication with the outside world. "Let me handle all the boring stuff," Edgar would say when I asked about bills or letters from my financial advisor. "You just focus on healing. There's plenty of time to deal with paperwork once you're back on your feet." The isolation was subtle but comprehensive. Edgar had legitimate reasons for every restriction he imposed, and his concern for my welfare seemed so genuine that questioning his methods felt ungrateful. He was sacrificing his time and energy to care for me, rearranging his work schedule and taking on additional responsibilities without complaint. But I began to notice small things that didn't quite align with Edgar's narrative of devoted care. He seemed unusually interested in my medication schedule, often reminding me to take pills I hadn't forgotten and suggesting that I might benefit from additional supplements to support my recovery. He also asked detailed questions about my daily routines at home, claiming he wanted to help me prepare for a smooth transition back to independent living. "When you go back to your house, we'll need to make some safety modifications," Edgar explained one afternoon, while helping me organize my pill dispenser. "Maybe some grab bars in the bathroom, non-slip strips on the stairs, perhaps a medical alert system in case you need help quickly." The suggestions were practical and thoughtful, but Edgar's tone carried an underlying assumption that my independence was now permanently compromised. He spoke about my future living situation as if the ankle injury had fundamentally changed my capabilities, rather than causing a temporary inconvenience that would heal completely. More concerning was Edgar's growing interest in my estate planning and financial arrangements. He claimed that my accident had made him realize how important it was for Ruby to understand my affairs in case of future emergencies. "Not that we expect anything to happen," Edgar assured me, "but it would give everyone peace of mind to know that Ruby could access your accounts or make medical decisions if you were ever unable to communicate your wishes." These conversations always occurred when Ruby wasn't home, and Edgar presented them as practical planning rather than attempts to gain control over my assets. But his knowledge of estate law and financial instruments seemed unusually sophisticated for a pharmaceutical sales representative, and his questions were becoming increasingly specific about account numbers, beneficiaries, and legal documentation. By the end of my second week in their apartment, I was beginning to understand that my temporary stay might be the beginning of a much more permanent arrangement, one that Edgar was orchestrating with the same careful attention to detail that had characterized his courtship of my daughter. The first medication mistake happened during my third week staying with Ruby and Edgar. I'd been taking the same blood pressure medication for 5 years, a small white pill I took every morning with breakfast. But when Edgar handed me my daily pills that Tuesday morning, something felt different about the routine. "Here you go, Harriet," Edgar said, placing the small medicine cup beside my coffee. "Your usual morning medications, plus that vitamin D supplement the doctor recommended for bone health after your fall." I looked down at the pills and immediately noticed that my blood pressure medication looked slightly different, still white and round, but perhaps a bit larger than usual. When I mentioned this to Edgar, he nodded knowingly. "The pharmacy switched to a generic brand," he explained smoothly. "Same medication, just a different manufacturer. I checked with them when I picked up your refill, and they assured me it's identical to what you've been taking." The explanation seemed reasonable, and Edgar's pharmaceutical background gave his words extra credibility. But something about the interaction bothered me, perhaps the fact that Edgar had picked up my prescription without asking, or the way he seemed to have an immediate answer for my concern, as if he'd been expecting the question. Over the following days, I began paying closer attention to the medications Edgar provided. The pills looked correct, but I started experiencing mild side effects that were new: occasional dizziness, slight nausea, and a general feeling of fatigue that Edgar attributed to my body adjusting to reduced activity during recovery. "It's completely normal," Edgar assured me, when I mentioned feeling unusually tired. "Your body has been through trauma with the fall, and you're not getting your usual exercise. Some adjustment symptoms are expected." But my forensic training had taught me to trust my instincts when something felt wrong, and these new symptoms coincided too closely with Edgar's management of my medication schedule. I decided to conduct a small experiment, something Edgar's pharmaceutical expertise wouldn't expect from a confused elderly woman. The next morning, instead of immediately taking the pills Edgar provided, I excused myself to use the bathroom and carefully examined each medication under the bright vanity lights. The blood pressure pill was indeed different from my usual prescription, but not in the way Edgar had described. This wasn't a simple generic substitution. The markings on the pill indicated a completely different medication. Using my phone, I discreetly photographed the pill and later researched the markings when Edgar was at work. What I discovered was deeply troubling. Edgar had been giving me a medication that was contraindicated for people with my medical history. While not immediately dangerous, the drug could cause cumulative effects that would gradually weaken my system and create symptoms that might be attributed to natural aging or the stress of my recent injury. This was my first concrete evidence that Edgar's care wasn't as benevolent as it appeared. Someone with his pharmaceutical training would absolutely know the difference between a generic substitution and a completely different medication. He was deliberately giving me drugs that would make me feel unwell, possibly to create a medical justification for extending my stay or questioning my ability to live independently. But the medication substitution was just the beginning of a pattern I was starting to recognize. Edgar had also taken control of my meal preparation, claiming that my reduced activity required careful attention to nutrition and portion control. He prepared elaborate, healthy meals that seemed designed to showcase his devotion to my welfare, but I noticed he was increasingly controlling about when and what I ate. I've been reading about nutrition for elderly recovery, Edgar explained one afternoon while preparing what he called a bone-healing soup, with ingredients I didn't recognize. Certain foods can significantly impact healing time, and I want to make sure you're getting optimal nutrition. The soups and stews Edgar prepared were delicious and seemed nutritious, but they had an unusual aftertaste that he claimed came from healing herbs and supplements he'd researched specifically for my condition. More concerning was his insistence that I finish everything he prepared, expressing worry about my appetite and nutritional intake if I left food on my plate. "Harriet, you barely touched your dinner," Edgar would say, with apparent concern. "Your body needs fuel to heal properly. I know the flavors might be different from what you're used to, but these ingredients are specifically chosen for their recovery properties." The pressure to consume everything Edgar prepared was subtle but persistent. He would sit with me during meals, engaging in pleasant conversation while monitoring how much I ate. If I seemed reluctant to finish something, he would share detailed research about the nutritional benefits of specific ingredients, making it clear that refusing his carefully prepared meals would be ungrateful and potentially harmful to my recovery. I also began noticing that Edgar was documenting my daily activities with unusual thoroughness. He kept a notebook where he recorded my medication times, meal consumption, sleep patterns, and any comments I made about pain or discomfort. When I asked about the notebook, Edgar explained it was something Ruby had requested. "Ruby wants to make sure we're tracking your progress properly," Edgar said, showing me pages of detailed notes. "As a nurse, she knows how important documentation is for recovery. This way, we can identify patterns and make sure your healing is progressing normally." But when I mentioned the notebook to Ruby during one of her brief visits home, she looked confused. "I never asked Edgar to keep detailed records," Ruby said. "I mean, it's thoughtful of him to monitor your recovery, but a daily log seems excessive for a sprained ankle." Edgar quickly explained that he'd initiated the documentation himself, claiming his pharmaceutical training had taught him the importance of tracking patient progress. Ruby accepted this explanation, but I filed away the discrepancy as another piece of evidence that Edgar's behavior wasn't entirely truthful. The most unsettling development was Edgar's growing interest in my mental state and cognitive function. He began asking questions designed to test my memory, claiming he was concerned about the effects of pain medication and reduced activity on my mental sharpness. "Harriet, do you remember what we discussed yesterday about the safety modifications for your house?" Edgar would ask, then look concerned when I provided answers that differed slightly from his recollection. "I'm a bit worried about some confusion I've been noticing," Edgar told Ruby one evening when he thought I was sleeping. "Nothing dramatic, but small memory lapses and some disorientation. It might be the pain medication, or it could be that the stress of the fall has affected her more than we realized." Ruby's response was predictably concerned, and I realized Edgar was building a case for my declining mental capacity, creating documentation and witness testimony that could support future claims about my inability to live independently or make sound decisions about my care. The pattern was becoming clear. Edgar was systematically undermining my physical health, controlling my environment, and documenting evidence of decline that he was manufacturing through medication manipulation and environmental stress. He was building a comprehensive case that would justify whatever long-term plans he had for my future, plans that clearly didn't include my return to independent living in my own home. The moment everything changed happened on a Thursday evening in early December, exactly 1 month into my stay at Ruby and Edgar's apartment. I'd been pretending to nap in the guest room when I heard Edgar on the phone in his home office, speaking in hushed tones that immediately caught my attention. Something about his voice, urgent, conspiratorial, completely different from his usual warm demeanor, made me strain to listen. "No, the timeline has to be accelerated," Edgar was saying to someone. "The ankle injury was perfect cover, but she's healing faster than expected, and Ruby's starting to ask questions about why the recovery is taking so long. I pressed my ear closer to the thin wall separating the guest room from Edgar's office, my heart pounding as I realized I was overhearing something I wasn't meant to hear. "Look, I've been building the medical documentation for weeks," Edgar continued. "The confusion, the medication reactions, the apparent cognitive decline, it's all documented. But if she goes back to her house before we can establish legal guardianship, we lose control of the situation entirely." Legal guardianship, the words hit me like ice water. Edgar wasn't just planning to extend my stay, he was working toward having me declared incompetent so he could gain legal control over my affairs. "The soup plan is still the best option," Edgar said after a pause. "It's untraceable, looks completely natural for someone her age with her medical history, and the beauty is that she'll consume it willingly because she trusts me. But I need another week to set up the life insurance beneficiary changes." My blood went cold as I realized Edgar was discussing my murder with the same casual tone he might use to plan a dinner party. But then his next words revealed something that made me understand just how carefully he'd orchestrated this entire scheme. "Ruby's schedule next Thursday is perfect. She's working a double shift, won't be home until Friday morning. That gives me plenty of time to call paramedics, play the devastated son-in-law, and establish the timeline. By the time Ruby gets home, Harriet will be gone, and everyone will be focused on comforting the grieving family." The conversation continued with Edgar discussing financial details that revealed the true scope of his plan. He'd somehow gained access to my account information and had been researching how to transfer assets after my death. More chilling was his mention of Ruby's unfortunate accident that would happen sometime after my estate was settled, and he'd gained access to the combined inheritance. Edgar wasn't just planning to murder me, he was planning to murder my daughter as well, once she'd served her purpose as a grieving widow who would inherit everything before meeting her own convenient demise. I remained frozen in place for several minutes after Edgar ended the call, my mind racing through the implications of what I'd just heard. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment crime of opportunity. Edgar had been planning this from the beginning, carefully positioning himself within our family to gain access to our assets, then systematically working to eliminate the obstacles to his inheritance. The ankle injury hadn't been the catalyst for his plan. It had been an unexpected gift that allowed him to accelerate a timeline he'd been developing for months. The medication substitutions, the dietary control, the documentation of my supposed decline, all of it had been preparation for this moment when he would poison me with something untraceable and watch me die while playing the role of the devoted caregiver who'd done everything possible to save me. But Edgar had made one critical miscalculation in his planning. He'd assumed he was dealing with a vulnerable elderly woman whose professional background was irrelevant to his modern scheme. What he didn't realize was that 4 decades of forensic toxicology had given me not just theoretical knowledge about poisons, but practical experience with the exact kind of methodical planning that characterized sophisticated murder plots. I knew how criminals thought because I'd spent my career studying their methods. I understood how they chose their weapons, established their alibis, and created reasonable doubt about their involvement. More importantly, I knew how they made mistakes, and Edgar was about to make several crucial errors that would destroy his carefully constructed plan. The first advantage I had was knowledge of his timeline. Edgar planned to poison me next Thursday, which gave me exactly 1 week to prepare my counter-strategy. The second advantage was his complete ignorance of my professional background's practical applications. Edgar knew I'd worked in forensic toxicology, but he assumed that meant academic knowledge rather than hands-on experience with criminal investigation techniques. Most importantly, Edgar had no idea that I'd been documenting his behavior since the medication substitutions began. My forensic training had kicked in the moment I noticed inconsistencies in his care, and I'd been quietly gathering evidence while pretending to be the confused, grateful patient he expected me to be. As I lay in that guest room bed, listening to Edgar move around the apartment with no idea that his entire plan had just been exposed, I realized that the next 7 days would determine whether Edgar's scheme succeeded or whether a lifetime of catching killers would finally pay off in the most personal way imaginable. The student was about to become the teacher, and Edgar Holt was about to learn what happened when someone tried to outsmart a professional who'd spent 4 decades staying one step ahead of people exactly like him. The real game was about to begin. The morning after overhearing Edgar's phone conversation, I woke up with the kind of crystal clear focus I hadn't felt since my most challenging cases at the crime lab. For the first time in weeks, I wasn't a confused elderly patient recovering from a minor injury. I was a forensic investigator with a murder to prevent and a killer to catch. My first priority was gathering concrete evidence without alerting Edgar to my awareness of his plans. Fortunately, my forensic training had taught me that criminals often kept detailed records of their schemes, believing they were too clever to be caught. Edgar's pharmaceutical background and methodical personality suggested he would be particularly prone to this kind of overconfidence. While Edgar was at work and Ruby was at the hospital, I conducted a systematic search of their apartment. My walking boot provided perfect cover. If Edgar returned unexpectedly, I could claim I was simply moving around for exercise or looking for something I'd misplaced. Edgar's home office was my primary target. The desk was locked, but 40 years of crime scene work had taught me a few unconventional skills. Using a hairpin, and the kind of patience that comes from examining evidence under microscopes, I gained access to Edgar's private files within minutes. What I discovered exceeded even my worst expectations. Edgar had created a comprehensive dossier on our entire family, complete with financial records, medical histories, and detailed timelines for what he called asset acquisition opportunities. The file on me was particularly thorough, including copies of my estate planning documents, analysis of my investment portfolio, and medical records that he'd obviously obtained through illegal means. But the most damning evidence was Edgar's methodology notebook, a detailed journal documenting his research into untraceable poisons, ideal dosages for elderly victims, and timing strategies for avoiding suspicion. The entries read like a how-to manual for elder murder, complete with references to specific toxins that mimicked natural death in people my age. The notebook revealed that Edgar had been planning my death for over 6 months, well before the ankle injury provided his opportunity. He'd researched my work history at the crime lab, specifically looking for blind spots in my knowledge that he could exploit. His choice of poison was particularly clever, a plant-based toxin that would cause symptoms resembling heart failure, virtually undetectable in routine autopsy procedures, unless the examiner specifically tested for exotic botanical compounds. Edgar had calculated that my professional background would actually work in his favor. The local coroner knew of my expertise and would be unlikely to order extensive toxicology testing on someone of my age and medical history, especially when the apparent cause of death fit expected patterns for elderly cardiac events. More chilling was Edgar's detailed planning for Ruby's eventual elimination. He'd researched her work schedule, identified opportunities to stage an accident at the hospital, and even selected the type of medical error that would be most believable given her position as head nurse. Edgar had calculated that inheriting from both of us would net him approximately $2.8 million, after which he planned to relocate to a non-extradition country, where he could live comfortably on our combined life's work. The notebook also revealed Edgar's previous criminal history under different identities. He'd successfully eliminated at least 3 elderly victims in other states, each time marrying into families with substantial assets before engineering convenient deaths that appeared natural. Edgar wasn't just an opportunistic killer, he was a serial predator who'd perfected his methods through years of practice. Using my phone, I photographed every page of Edgar's documentation, ensuring I captured his handwriting, his research sources, and his specific plans for my murder. The evidence was overwhelming, but I needed to be strategic about how I used it. Confronting Edgar directly would likely result in an acceleration of his timeline, or a change of methods that might be harder to detect. Instead, I decided to implement a plan that would use Edgar's own confidence against him. My forensic experience had taught me that the best way to catch sophisticated criminals was to let them proceed with their schemes while secretly undermining their ability to succeed. That afternoon, I called my old colleague Dr. Toby Everdeen, who'd taken over as head of the state crime lab after my retirement. Using the excuse of catching up with an old friend, I carefully steered our conversation toward recent developments in toxicology detection methods. "Toby, I've been reading about advances in botanical poison detection," I said casually. "Are the new mass spectrometry techniques really as sensitive as the journals suggest?" Dr. Everdeen was delighted to discuss the technical improvements, explaining how modern equipment could now detect plant-based toxins at concentrations that would have been impossible to identify during my active career. More importantly, he mentioned that the lab had recently implemented routine screening for exotic compounds in any death involving someone with connections to the forensic community. "We've learned to be extra thorough when examining people with law enforcement or scientific backgrounds," Dr. Everdeen explained. "Too many criminals think they can outsmart forensic professionals by using sophisticated methods, not realizing we've anticipated those exact approaches." Perfect. Edgar's plan relied on the assumption that his chosen poison would go undetected, but I just confirmed that any suspicious death involving someone with my background would automatically trigger the exact type of analysis that would expose his method. My next call was to my attorney, Hilda Mabel, using the pretext of updating my estate planning documents. During our conversation, I mentioned concerns about Edgar's unusual interest in my finances, and asked about protective measures for elderly people who suspected family members might be planning financial exploitation. "Harriet, if you have any suspicions about Edgar's motives, we should document them immediately," Miss Mabel advised. "Elder financial abuse is more common than people realize, and the legal system takes these concerns very seriously when there's proper documentation." By the end of that day, I'd established a network of professional allies who would be prepared to investigate thoroughly if anything happened to me. I'd also created a detailed record of Edgar's plans, safely stored in multiple locations where he couldn't access or destroy the evidence. Edgar returned from work that evening with his usual cheerful demeanor, completely unaware that his entire scheme had been exposed and undermined. As he prepared dinner and asked about my day with apparent concern, I smiled pleasantly and played the role of the grateful patient he expected me to be. But inside, I was already planning the surprise that would turn Edgar's carefully orchestrated murder plot into the trap that would destroy him forever. The next morning, I made the most important phone call of my investigation. Ruby was working an early shift, and Edgar had left for what he claimed was a multi-day pharmaceutical conference in the state capital. Perfect timing for implementing the next phase of my counter-strategy. "Edna, it's Harriet Dame," I said when my longtime friend answered. "I hope I'm not calling too early, but I could really use your help with something urgent." Edna Holt, ironically sharing Edgar's surname despite being no relation, had been my closest friend since we'd worked together at the crime lab 30 years ago. She'd retired as the chief forensic pathologist and maintained connections throughout the law enforcement community that would prove invaluable for what I was planning. "Hattie, you sound different," Edna observed immediately. "What's going on?" Over the next hour, I shared everything I'd discovered about Edgar's plans, showing Edna the photographs of his documentation and playing recordings I'd made of his suspicious phone conversations using a small device I'd purchased online. Edna listened with the same analytical attention she'd once applied to complex autopsy findings. This is one of the most sophisticated elder abuse schemes I've encountered, Edna said after reviewing the evidence. Edgar's pharmaceutical knowledge makes him particularly dangerous because he understands exactly how to exploit weaknesses in standard investigative procedures. But Edna's expertise extended beyond forensic pathology. Her husband had been a federal prosecutor specializing in financial crimes, and she'd absorbed enough legal knowledge over the years to understand how to build cases that would hold up in court. The challenge, Edna explained, is that we need to catch Edgar in the act of attempting murder, not just planning it. His documentation is compelling evidence of intent, but a good defense attorney could argue that these were fantasy writings or research for a novel. We need to let him proceed far enough to commit actual crimes while ensuring your safety. Edna's solution was both elegant and terrifying. We would allow Edgar to serve me the poison soup while secretly recording everything and having medical professionals standing by to administer immediate treatment. The key was identifying the exact poison Edgar planned to use and preparing the appropriate antidote in advance. Based on Edgar's research notes, Edna said, studying the photographs I'd taken, he's planning to use aconitine from monkshood plants. It's an excellent choice from a criminal perspective. Highly toxic, mimics heart failure, and degrades quickly in the body. But it also has a reliable antidote if administered promptly. We spent the afternoon developing a comprehensive plan that would protect me while gathering irrefutable evidence of Edgar's attempted murder. Edna contacted her former colleagues at the state police, explaining that we had credible evidence of a planned homicide and needed covert support to prevent it. Detective Kurt Mabel, Hilda the attorney's son, as small towns often interconnect in unexpected ways, agreed to coordinate the law enforcement response. His team would establish surveillance around Ruby and Edgar's apartment, monitor Edgar's communications, and be prepared to intervene the moment I signaled that the poisoning attempt was in progress. Mrs. Dame, I have to ask if you're certain you want to proceed with this plan. Detective Mabel said during our clandestine meeting at Edna's house. We could arrest Edgar based on the evidence you've already gathered, but proving intent to commit murder is more difficult than proving attempted murder. I understood the risks, but I also understood something else. Edgar's pattern suggested he would simply disappear and resurface elsewhere with a new identity if his current scheme was disrupted before completion. The only way to ensure he never hurt another family was to catch him in the act of committing the crime he'd planned so meticulously. Detective, I've spent 4 decades studying how criminals escape justice because investigators acted too early or with insufficient evidence, I explained. Edgar is sophisticated enough to have contingency plans if he suspects exposure. Our only chance to stop him permanently is to let him convict himself through his own actions. Dr. Edna arranged for a discreet medical team to be positioned near the apartment during Edgar's planned dinner. They would have the specific antidote for aconitine poisoning ready for immediate administration, along with cardiac support equipment in case Edgar's dosage calculations were more aggressive than his notes suggested. The most crucial element of our plan was maintaining my cover as the unsuspecting victim. Edgar had to believe that his scheme was proceeding normally, which meant I needed to continue displaying the exact level of confusion and dependence he expected. Any change in my behavior might alert him to modify his plans or abandon the attempt entirely. Hattie, you're going to have to give the performance of your life, Edna warned. Edgar will be watching for any sign that you suspect something. One wrong reaction, and this entire operation fails. We rehearsed various scenarios, preparing for different ways Edgar might present the poisoned soup and ensuring I knew exactly when to signal for help. The recording equipment would capture Edgar's words and actions, but the timing of medical intervention was critical too early, and Edgar could claim he'd changed his mind too late, and the antidote might not be effective. As Edgar returned from his supposed conference that Friday evening, cheerfully greeting me with his usual warmth and asking about my week, I realized that in exactly 6 days, one of us would be facing justice while the other faced freedom. Edgar thought he held all the advantages: knowledge, planning, and the element of surprise. What he didn't realize was that he was walking into a trap set by someone who'd spent a lifetime catching people exactly like him, supported by a network of professionals who were just as determined to see justice served. The final game was about to begin, and this time the house always wins. Monday morning brought an unexpected acceleration of Edgar's timeline that nearly derailed our carefully planned counter-operation. I was sitting in the apartment's living room, pretending to read while actually reviewing mental notes about the surveillance equipment Edna's team had discreetly installed, when Edgar approached with an expression of calculated concern I'd learned to recognize as dangerous. "Harriet, I've been thinking about our conversation last week regarding your living arrangements," Edgar began, settling into the chair across from me with the practiced demeanor of someone delivering rehearsed lines. "Ruby and I are concerned that your recovery isn't progressing as quickly as we'd hoped." This was new territory. Edgar's original plan, according to his documentation, involved waiting until Thursday for the poisoning attempt. Something had changed, and I needed to understand what was driving this deviation from his established timeline. "I feel much better, dear," I replied carefully, maintaining the slightly confused elderly persona Edgar expected. "The ankle barely bothers me anymore, and I'm looking forward to getting back to my own house soon." Edgar's expression tightened almost imperceptibly, a micro-expression I would have missed if I hadn't been analyzing his every reaction with forensic attention. My mention of returning home had clearly triggered some concern in his planning. "Actually, that's what I wanted to discuss," Edgar continued smoothly. "I took the liberty of arranging a consultation with Dr. Erwin Everdeen, a geriatric specialist who focuses on cognitive assessment for elderly patients experiencing trauma-related changes." My blood ran cold. Dr. Erwin Everdeen was Toby's brother, but unlike my ally at the crime lab, Erwin had a reputation for being easily influenced by family members who wanted elderly relatives declared incompetent. Edgar had clearly researched which medical professionals would be most likely to support his narrative about my declining mental state. "I don't think that's necessary," I protested with just the right amount of confused resistance. "I feel perfectly fine mentally, perhaps a bit tired from the recovery, but nothing that suggests I need psychiatric evaluation." "Of course you feel fine," Edgar said with patronizing gentleness. "That's often how these cognitive changes manifest. The patient doesn't recognize the symptoms that are obvious to others. Ruby and I have documented several instances of confusion, memory lapses, and disorientation since your accident." Edgar produced a notebook, different from his murder planning journal, but equally detailed in documenting fabricated evidence of my supposed mental decline. The entries were comprehensive and convincing, describing incidents that had never occurred but were written with such specificity that they would be difficult to refute without witnesses. "For instance," Edgar continued, reading from his fabricated documentation, "last Tuesday you asked me 3 times whether Ruby was working that day, despite having discussed her schedule at breakfast. On Thursday you couldn't remember taking your morning medications and became agitated when I reminded you. These patterns suggest possible early-stage dementia that requires professional evaluation." The lies were sophisticated and plausible, the kind of subtle cognitive changes that could easily be attributed to stress, medication effects, or normal aging. Edgar had created a fictional narrative of decline that would be difficult to disprove, especially when presented by a concerned family member with pharmaceutical training. But Edgar's acceleration of the competency evaluation timeline revealed something crucial about his planning. He was feeling pressure from somewhere, possibly Ruby's growing questions about why my recovery was taking longer than expected. The ankle injury that had provided perfect cover for Edgar's scheme was healing too quickly, threatening to expose the artificial reasons for extending my stay. "When is this appointment scheduled?" I asked, trying to sound appropriately confused and concerned. "This afternoon," Edgar replied. "Dr. Everdeen had a cancellation, and I thought it would be better to address these concerns sooner rather than later. Ruby will meet us at the office after her shift ends." The timing was strategic and alarming. Edgar was arranging for Ruby to witness my supposed competency evaluation, using her presence to legitimize whatever conclusions Dr. Everdeen reached about my mental state. If the evaluation supported Edgar's narrative of cognitive decline, it would provide justification for legal guardianship proceedings that could be initiated immediately. I realized that Edgar's murder plan might have evolved beyond simply poisoning me. If he could have me declared incompetent and gain legal guardianship, he would have immediate access to my assets and the authority to make medical decisions on my behalf. The poisoning could then be framed as a mercy killing of someone suffering from dementia, a tragic but understandable action by a devoted caregiver overwhelmed by the burden of care. "I suppose if you and Ruby think it's necessary," I said with resigned acceptance, while mentally calculating how to alert Edna and Detective Mabel about this change in timeline. Edgar's smile carried a satisfaction that chilled me. He believed he was maneuvering an elderly woman with declining mental faculties into a trap she couldn't recognize or escape. What Edgar didn't realize was that he was actually maneuvering himself into a countertrap that had been specifically designed to catch criminals who thought they were smarter than their victims. While Edgar made phone calls to confirm the appointment details, I excused myself to use the bathroom and quickly sent a coded text message to Edna. "Edgar moving faster than expected. Professional consultation this afternoon. May need immediate intervention." Edna's response was swift and reassuring. "Team is ready. Proceed as planned." "You've got this." As I returned to the living room where Edgar was waiting with false concern and manufactured care, I realized that the next few hours would determine whether his accelerated timeline would succeed or whether our counter-operation would adapt quickly enough to turn Edgar's desperation into the evidence that would destroy him forever. The afternoon would bring either my professional vindication or Edgar's temporary victory, but either way, the endgame was rapidly approaching. The competency evaluation with Dr. Erwin Everdeen turned into the first direct confrontation between Edgar's manufactured narrative and my professional reputation. What Edgar hadn't anticipated was that Dr. Everdeen, despite his reputation for being easily influenced, was also cautious about making determinations that could be challenged by other medical professionals. "Mrs. Dame, Dr. Everdeen said after completing his standard cognitive assessment, "I'm finding your mental acuity to be remarkably sharp for someone who allegedly experienced the confusion episodes your son-in-law has documented." I watched Edgar's face carefully as the doctor delivered this unexpected assessment. For just a moment his mask of concerned care slipped, revealing something cold and calculating underneath. "Doctor, with respect," Edgar interjected, "these episodes are intermittent. Harriet has good days and bad days, and today might simply be one of her clearer periods." But Dr. Everdeen had been practicing geriatric medicine for 30 years, and he recognized the difference between genuine cognitive decline and manufactured concerns. "Mr. Holt, the patterns you've described don't align with any known dementia progression. Mrs. Dame's responses are not only appropriate but demonstrate the kind of analytical thinking I'd expect from someone with her professional background." Ruby, who had arrived midway through the evaluation, looked increasingly uncomfortable as the discussion continued. Her nursing training was making her question the discrepancies between Edgar's documentation and what she was observing. "Edgar," Ruby said quietly, "Mom seems perfectly normal to me. Maybe we've been overreacting to some minor confusion that was just stress-related." Edgar's composure began cracking under the unexpected resistance from both the medical professional and his own wife. His carefully constructed narrative was falling apart in real time, and I could see him calculating his remaining options. "I think there's been some misunderstanding about Mrs. Dame's condition," Dr. Everdeen concluded. "Based on my evaluation, she shows no signs of cognitive impairment that would justify concerns about her ability to live independently or make her own decisions." The drive back to the apartment was tense with unspoken conflict. Edgar gripped the steering wheel with white knuckles while Ruby sat in confused silence, processing the gap between her husband's claims and the medical professional's assessment. But it was when we arrived home that Edgar's mask finally dropped completely. "Ruby, I need you to go to the pharmacy and pick up your mother's prescriptions," Edgar said as soon as we entered the apartment. "I called ahead and they're ready for pickup." "I can pick them up tomorrow," Ruby replied. "I'd rather stay and talk about what Dr. Everdeen said. I'm concerned that we might have been misreading Mom's condition." Edgar's voice took on an edge I'd never heard before. "Ruby, I need you to go now. There are some family matters that Harriet and I need to discuss privately." The firmness of his tone surprised Ruby, but she acquiesced, grabbing her keys with obvious reluctance. "I'll be back in an hour," she told me, kissing my cheek. "We'll figure out what's best for you, Mom." As soon as Ruby's car disappeared down the street, Edgar's entire demeanor transformed. The loving son-in-law vanished, replaced by someone I barely recognized. "Well, Harriet," Edgar said, his voice carrying a menace that made my skin crawl, "that didn't go quite as I planned." Dr. Everdeen was supposed to be more cooperative. I maintained my confused elderly woman persona, though my heart was racing. "Edgar dear, I don't understand what you mean. The doctor said I was fine." "Drop the act," Edgar snapped, moving closer with predatory intent. "I know you've been more alert than you've been pretending. I've seen you watching me, analyzing my behavior like you're still working one of your little crime lab cases." The moment I'd been dreading and preparing for had finally arrived. Edgar had abandoned all pretense, and I was now facing the real man who'd been hiding behind months of careful manipulation. "You think because you worked in forensics that you're smarter than me," Edgar continued, his voice growing more threatening. "You have no idea what you're dealing with. I've done this before, successfully, and I'm not going to let some retired lab technician ruin everything I've worked for." I backed toward the kitchen, trying to maintain distance while positioning myself near the emergency alert device Edna's team had given me. But Edgar was blocking my access to both the device and any exit routes. "Here's what's going to happen," Edgar said with chilling calm. "You're going to have a tragic accident tonight. A fall down the stairs perhaps, or maybe a reaction to medication that causes cardiac arrest. Ruby will be devastated, but she'll inherit everything, and then eventually she'll have her own unfortunate accident once the estate is settled." The casual way Edgar discussed murdering both Ruby and me revealed the depth of his psychopathy. This wasn't a crime of passion or desperation. It was the calculated planning of a serial killer who'd perfected his methods through multiple successful murders. "The beauty of my approach," Edgar continued, "is that everything looks natural. Elderly people die from accidents and medical complications every day. No one questions it when the grieving family handles all the arrangements." Edgar moved toward the kitchen counter where he kept the special ingredients for his elaborate meals. "I was planning to wait until Thursday for our special dinner, but Dr. Everdeen's inconvenient honesty has forced me to accelerate the timeline." As Edgar reached into the refrigerator and pulled out ingredients I now recognized as the components for his lethal soup, I realized that all our careful planning was about to be tested in the most crucial way possible. The recorded evidence, the surveillance team, the medical backup, everything depended on my ability to survive the next few hours, while Edgar prepared and served what he intended to be my final meal. The hunter had finally revealed himself, and now we would discover whether the hunted had prepared well enough to survive. Edgar began preparing what he called his special recipe with the methodical precision of someone who'd done this before. As he arranged ingredients on the counter, some I recognized, others that looked suspiciously like the botanical specimens he'd been researching, I knew I was watching a killer perfect his craft. "You know, Harriet," Edgar said conversationally while chopping what appeared to be fresh monkshood roots, "I almost admire your professional background. It's made this challenge more interesting than my previous work." The casual admission to multiple murders confirmed everything I'd suspected about Edgar's history. He wasn't just planning to kill me, he was enjoying the process, savoring what he believed would be his most sophisticated achievement. "The irony is delicious," Edgar continued, stirring the pot with theatrical flair. "A forensic toxicologist being poisoned by someone who understands her own field better than she does. Your expertise will actually work against you, because the local coroner will assume someone with your background would never fall victim to something so obvious." I had positioned myself near the kitchen island, close enough to the hidden recording device to capture Edgar's confession while maintaining access to the emergency alert that would summon Edna's team. The key was timing. I needed Edgar to serve the soup and make his final incriminating statements before triggering the rescue. "Tell me something, Edgar," I said, maintaining my frightened elderly woman act while gathering crucial intelligence. "How many families have you destroyed with this same method?" Edgar's smile was predatory and proud. "You'd be surprised how many lonely widows and vulnerable elderly people are just waiting for someone to take care of them. The family in Minnesota, the sweet old man in Oregon, that charming couple in Florida, they all trusted me completely right until the end." As Edgar ladled the steaming soup into my favorite china bowl, a cruel touch that demonstrated his attention to psychological manipulation, I discreetly activated the emergency signal that would alert Detective Mabel's team. "The best part," Edgar said, setting the bowl before me with mock ceremony, "is that Ruby will never suspect anything. She'll be grateful for how devoted I was to your care, how I tried everything to keep you comfortable in your final days." The soup smelled delicious, exactly like the mushroom bisque Edgar had served numerous times before. Only this time, I knew it contained enough aconitine to stop my heart within minutes of consumption. "Go ahead, Harriet," Edgar urged, sitting across from me with anticipation. "I made it just the way you like it." I lifted the spoon, knowing that Edna's medical team was monitoring from their position outside and would intervene the moment I signaled distress. But I also knew that Edgar needed to believe his plan was succeeding long enough to make the final statements that would seal his conviction. "Before I eat," I said slowly, "I want you to know that I understand what you've done. The medication substitutions, the manufactured confusion, the systematic gaslighting, I've been documenting everything." Edgar's expression shifted from confident satisfaction to wary concern. "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about the fact that I've known about your plan for over a week," I said, setting down the spoon and looking directly into his eyes. "I'm talking about the recordings of your phone conversations, the photographs of your research materials, and the law enforcement team that's been monitoring this apartment since yesterday." The color drained from Edgar's face as he realized that his carefully orchestrated murder was actually a trap that had been closing around him for days. "You see, Edgar," I continued, "you made one critical mistake in your planning. You assumed that a retired forensic toxicologist would be helpless against someone with pharmaceutical knowledge. What you didn't realize is that catching killers was my specialty for 43 years. As sirens began approaching in the distance, Edgar lunged across the table toward me with desperate fury, but it was too late. The doors burst open as Detective Mabel's team moved in with professional precision, surrounding Edgar before he could reach me. The soup sat cooling in its bowl, the evidence that would convict a serial killer who'd finally met his match. Edgar's arrest was swift and comprehensive, but the aftermath revealed the true scope of his criminal enterprise in ways that shocked even my experienced investigative team. As Detective Mabel's officers placed Edgar in handcuffs, he made one final attempt to manipulate the situation. "This is all a misunderstanding," Edgar protested as they read him his rights. "Harriet has been experiencing confusion and paranoid delusions. She's fabricated this entire scenario because she's afraid of losing her independence." But Detective Mabel had been listening to our recorded conversation through the surveillance equipment, and Edgar's own words had provided all the evidence needed for multiple murder charges. "Mr. Holt," Detective Mabel said calmly, "we have recordings of you confessing to murders in Minnesota, Oregon, and Florida, plus detailed documentation of your plan to kill Mrs. Dame and her daughter. Your manipulation tactics might work on vulnerable elderly people, but they don't work on law enforcement." The forensic analysis of Edgar's special soup confirmed our worst fears. The aconitine concentration was more than sufficient to cause cardiac arrest in someone my age. Edna's medical team confirmed that consuming even a small amount would have been fatal within 30 minutes, making Edgar's intended method both sophisticated and brutally effective. Ruby's reaction to learning about her husband's true nature was devastating to witness. When she arrived home to find police cars surrounding their apartment, and Edgar being led away in handcuffs, the emotional shock was overwhelming. "Mom, what's happening?" Ruby asked, her voice breaking as she struggled to process the scene. "Why are they arresting Edgar?" Explaining to my daughter that the man she'd loved and trusted had been planning to murder both of us was one of the most difficult conversations of my life. Ruby's training as a nurse helped her understand the technical aspects of Edgar's poisoning method, but accepting the betrayal of someone she'd shared her life with required professional counseling and months of healing. The subsequent investigation revealed that Edgar's criminal career spanned over a decade and included at least 7 confirmed murders across 6 states. His method was consistently sophisticated. He would target families with elderly members and substantial assets, establish himself as a trustworthy caregiver, then systematically eliminate obstacles to inheritance through carefully planned natural deaths. Edgar's trial became a landmark case in elder abuse prosecution, with testimony from surviving family members of his previous victims, providing heartbreaking accounts of how he'd destroyed their loved ones through identical manipulation tactics. The pattern was so consistent that prosecutors were able to establish Edgar as a serial predator who'd refined his methods through years of successful murders. The judge sentenced Edgar to life imprisonment without possibility of parole for the attempted murder charges, plus consecutive life sentences for the confirmed deaths in other states. During sentencing, Edgar showed no remorse for his actions and attempted to claim that his victims had been willing participants in their own deaths. "Holt," the judge said during sentencing, "your crimes represent a particularly heinous form of betrayal that targets society's most vulnerable members. Your systematic exploitation of elderly people and their families demonstrates a level of calculation and cruelty that demands the maximum penalty available under law." The conviction brought closure to families who'd lost loved ones to Edgar's schemes, but it also highlighted the broader issue of elder abuse and the sophisticated methods predators use to exploit vulnerable people. Ruby and I became advocates for elder abuse prevention, sharing our story to help others recognize warning signs and protect themselves from similar predators. Edgar's network of criminal contacts was also investigated, revealing connections to other individuals involved in identity theft, financial fraud, and elder exploitation schemes. His arrest led to a broader crackdown on organized elder abuse that resulted in dozens of additional prosecutions. Most importantly, Edgar's failure sent a message to other predators that elderly people weren't helpless victims to be exploited without consequence. Sometimes the people who appear most vulnerable are actually the most dangerous opponents a criminal can face. 6 months after Edgar's conviction, I found myself standing in my kitchen on Elm Street preparing soup for Sunday dinner, but this time the guest joining me was Ruby, and every ingredient was exactly what it appeared to be. The simple act of cooking had taken on new meaning after surviving someone's attempt to use my own trust and appetite as weapons against me. The experience transformed not just my understanding of family dynamics, but my entire perspective on the relationship between vulnerability and strength. For decades I'd studied criminal behavior from the analytical distance of laboratory evidence and case files. Edgar's scheme forced me to apply that knowledge in the most personal way possible, defending not just my own life but my daughter's future. Ruby's healing process had been more challenging than my own. While I could process Edgar's betrayal through the lens of professional experience with criminal psychology, Ruby had to rebuild her entire understanding of love, trust, and judgment. The man she'd believed was her devoted husband had actually been a serial killer who'd planned to murder us both for financial gain. "Mom," Ruby said one afternoon while we worked together in my garden, "I keep wondering if there were signs I should have seen. Warning signals that might have protected us if I'd been more observant." "Sweetheart," I replied, gently transplanting the roses that had survived winter's harshness, "Edgar's greatest skill was appearing to be exactly what people needed him to be. You saw a devoted husband because that's the performance he'd perfected through years of practice. Your trust wasn't naive, it was normal human behavior that he exploited through calculated deception." The investigation into Edgar's background had revealed the sophisticated nature of his identity construction. He'd spent years developing false credentials, establishing fake work histories, and creating the kind of believable persona that could pass scrutiny from intelligent, educated people. Ruby's failure to detect his true nature wasn't a personal failing, it was evidence of Edgar's professional-level skill at manipulation. But the experience had also revealed strengths neither of us knew we possessed. My forensic training had provided the tools necessary to recognize and counter Edgar's scheme, while Ruby's medical knowledge had helped her understand the technical aspects of his poisoning method and support the investigation that led to his conviction. More importantly, our ordeal had demonstrated that age and apparent vulnerability could actually be advantages in the right circumstances. Edgar's assumption that elderly people were easy targets had blinded him to the possibility that his intended victim might be more dangerous than he was. The roses in my garden were blooming more beautifully than ever, tended with the same careful attention I'd learned to apply to protecting myself and the people I loved. Each morning, I watered them while reflecting on how close I'd come to losing everything, and how the strength I found in my darkest moments had become the foundation for a more purposeful future. Edgar had thought he could break me by exploiting my trust and isolation. Instead, he'd actually strengthened my connections to family and community, while destroying his own carefully constructed life through arrogance and overconfidence. The poisoned soup he'd prepared with such cruel calculation had become the evidence that ensured he'd never hurt another family. His attempt to use my professional background against me had actually provided the expertise necessary to catch him in an unbreakable trap. Sometimes the hunter becomes the hunted, and sometimes justice prevails over evil. In our case, both proved true. The woman Edgar tried to poison with soup lived to serve him a dish he'll be tasting for the rest of his life, cold justice, with no possibility of seconds. After my son-in-law served me poisoned soup, he was shocked to see me alive because I had 43 years of experience catching killers exactly like him. And that experience had taught me the most important lesson of all: never underestimate someone who's spent a lifetime learning how to survive.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.